Okay, thank you, Khaled. And good afternoon. I have to say you're all guinea pigs because although I've done hundreds of presentations, I've never done a webinar. So I'm interested in using this new format, and we're hoping to use it ourselves for education come the fall. So because I don't know the background and can't ask you, I'm going to do just a brief overview of the TCPS, very brief, so to give you some context, and then head more into some selected highlights that relate more specifically, as Khaled said, to privacy and to clinical trials. And of course, I'm happy to take questions on any aspect of the TCPS. So, the TCPS is it's a principle-based policy. It's a joint policy of all three of Canada's main federal research agencies, so it's intended to cover all forms of research involving humans, and its primary goal is to provide some guidance for the ethical conduct of such research. So it's intended to cover, and you will see that with the examples in the new TCPS, it tries to cover both biomedical examples, examples from the social sciences and humanities, and from natural sciences and engineering, which do affect humans as well. Who is mandatorily covered by the TCPS? Well, all research involving humans that's conducted under the auspices of institutions that are eligible for funding by one or more of the agencies. And I emphasize eligible for funding because the source of the funding is not actually what determines whether or not the TCPS applies. It's the fact that it's conducted by researchers who are associated with institutions that are eligible for agency funding. So that's a fairly broad scope. It doesn't, of course, then cover in a mandatory way any research with a non-eligible institution or research by individuals or independent, say, community-based research that's done entirely in the private sector. But we do feel that the TCPS has a reach that's a bit broader because it's often used as an example to the extent that people think that it is a good or a useful document. Some organizations have adopted it who are not necessarily covered within the parameters I've just described. Who's responsible for its oversight? Well, the Panel on Research Ethics is a volunteer expert body that's appointed by the presidents of the three research agencies, and its mandate is to promote high ethical standards of conduct in research involving humans through the development, evolution, interpretation, and implementation of the TCPS. And the Secretariat that I head up is a body housed within the three institutions that supports the panel and also provides ethics advice to the agencies. Just to let you know, the TCPS was first put forward in 1998, and it existed largely without any amendments or revisions until we commenced this major revision about 3 years ago. And as you may know, 2 drafts went out to the public for consultation, and we had extensive input from the research community and members of the public. And the final document that we're dealing with today is a result of integrating many of those excellent comments that we received. The aim of this new revision was both to provide continuity. There was a lot that was good and very solid in the original TCPS, its basic principles and its basic approach to the ethics of human research. But we also felt that there was a need to clarify and amplify the guidance provided, and also obviously to update it. Research is a very rapidly moving field, and 12 years is a long time. We needed to fill some gaps. For instance, there was no chapter on research involving Aboriginal peoples. There was just a best practices section. We now have a very full and rich chapter on that area that I won't necessarily go into today. We wanted to identify roles and responsibilities of the actors in the research enterprise more clearly, not just to say that something should be done, but to specify whose responsibility it is to do it. And also to make the document, although it's larger now and may seem a bit more intimidating because it's big, we actually feel that it's more useful and user-friendly. It's certainly searchable. The official version is the online version. the electronic version. It also has an index now. We have a glossary. We have defined terms, and you can see those definitions. And we have tables of concordance that show the relationship between sections in the previous document and the current one. And it also indicates what elements of the current document are actually new. The basic foundation for the TCPS, this is an element of continuity, is respect for human dignity. That, of course, hasn't changed. It's a fairly universal principle in research ethics. And it requires that research be conducted in a manner sensitive to the inherent worth of all human beings. It is expressed through 3 core principles. We have simplified and sort of consolidated the 8 principles of the previous document into 3: respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice. And as I said before, we have tried to clarify the roles, in particular the roles of the researcher and of the Research Ethics Board, which is responsible for reviewing research. So we feel that this document starts out by being a document for researchers to use as they're designing their research. They need to, in order to design research that is ethically sound, you need to be aware of the TCPS, but also of your own institution's policies, whatever requirements your REB may have, your Research Ethics Board, and of course, whatever guidelines, whether they're international or discipline-specific, and legislation that may apply to your form of research. And of course, one always wants to take the perspective of the participant in thinking, how will this research affect the participant? Things that may seem not difficult or embarrassing or intrusive to a researcher may actually be so from the perspective of the participant, or harmful. So that's a perspective that always must be kept top of mind. And of course, research goes through a number of stages, and the ethics of research must be maintained right from the design right through to the conduct and the dissemination research. The Research Ethics Board, of course, has responsibility for the initial and the continuing review of the acceptability of the research under the terms of TCPS 2. It needs to function impartially and provide a fair and open hearing to researchers. And when it makes its decision, particularly if it is going to deny the ethics approval for the research, it must provide reasoned and documented opinions. It's not a judicial body, but this is an important decision for researchers, and they have a right to understand why a decision is being made. And there is within the document a right of appeal from an REB's refusal. Of course, the REB itself must understand the policies of its institution, for example, conflict of interest policies or others, document retention policies, and any other documents or guidelines that are relevant to the particular type of research. And it also has a responsibility to educate not only its own members, but the researchers that it deals with. This is a function we have tried to promote in the new version of the TCPS. We have tried to encourage dialogue between researchers and REB members. We think that's probably the best way, early dialogue, to ensure that research goes through the ethics review process in a smooth and expeditious way. So I won't spend too long on the scope of the document. There are things that are covered by the basic scope of the document depends on the definition of research. So we have said that research requires REB review when it involves living human participants or human biological materials, as well as human embryos, fetuses, fetal tissue, reproductive materials, and stem cells from living and deceased individuals. It does not require REB review when it relies exclusively on publicly available information, and that's a bit controversial. We like to think that that's a clear category, but it is very open to differing points of view, what is exclusively publicly available, or where it involves the observation of people in public places, or relies exclusively on secondary use of anonymous information or anonymous human biological materials. And we can discuss these later if they are of interest. All ethics review that's done under the TCPS is done in accordance with what we call the proportionate approach, which is you have to decide first what level of risk is entailed in this research. Is it minimal risk? If so, it may only require delegated review as opposed to review by the full board of the full research ethics board. And once that level of review is determined, then all research, whether it's being done at a delegated level or a full board level, the reviewer has to assess the risks, the benefits, and the ethical implications of the research. And of course, there has to be an appropriate risk-benefit ratio. So the potential benefits must outweigh the risks. There are non-research activities that look a bit like research, but that for our purposes are not covered by TCPS2, things like quality assurance or performance evaluation activities. And in this document, we try to clarify the relationship between ethics review and scholarly review or peer review and distinguish between the two. I've just pointed out here that Chapter 3 deals with consent. It's a large and very important chapter, but I've tried to pull out here a couple of, or a few examples of elements of consent, of informed consent, that may relate in particular to areas of interest to this audience. So, for example, telling people when their data may be withdrawn. It's obviously always the right of the participant to withdraw from the research. But there is a question as to whether they can withdraw their data as well. And we have said that as part of informed consent, you must inform the participant of their right to request the withdrawal of data or human biological materials, and as well inform them if there are going to be any limitations on the feasibility of that withdrawal. So if it is not possible, in fact, if the data has been aggregated and it's not possible to pull out my information when I withdraw, then I need to know that beforehand, that that's not going to be an option that's open to me. We have talked about the need to inform people about the possibility that the results of the research may be commercialized, and also to inform potential participants of any real potential or perceived conflicts of interest on the part of the researchers or their institutions or the research sponsors. These are all things that may affect someone's willingness to participate in research. We ask that researchers are required to indicate what information will be collected about the participants and for what purposes, and an indication of who will have access to the information collected about the identity of participants, and a description of how confidentiality will be protected. And we go into more detail on that in the chapter on confidentiality, but it's stated right up front here as part of informed consent. We also require that researchers describe the anticipated uses of the data and information indicating who may have a duty to disclose information collected and to whom such disclosures could be made. So very much putting right up front the need to inform people what information you're going to be collecting about them and how that information may be used or distributed. And of course, in the case of clinical trials, information on stopping rules and when researchers may remove participants from a trial. So these are just elements. You see there's a long list. There's a quite extensive article and application section on this aspect, in information and informed consent. We've added a new article on incidental findings, which were not really an issue in research when the TCPS was first written. And we've clarified aspects of critical inquiry. I'm not going to go into these in any great detail. We've also made more flexible the requirements for how you document consent. So a written consent form is not the single and only way you can show that you've received consent from a participant. Let's get into privacy and confidentiality more specifically. What we've done, actually at the beginning of each chapter, but certainly in this chapter as well, is we've tried to identify key concepts at the outset key concepts that are specifically important for that particular chapter. So in the case of Chapter 5, we have discussed what we mean by privacy, what we mean by confidentiality, what we mean by security, both, sorry for the fire alarm in Ottawa here, what we mean by security, which can be physical, administrative, or technical safeguards for security, identifiable information, and we have a classification of different types of information. So we talk about information that may be directly identifying, indirectly identifying, coded, anonymized, or anonymous. And the more I learn about this field, the more I caution people that what can be considered truly anonymous information is actually an extremely limited category. There is the primary article in this chapter talks about the researcher's duty to safeguard information entrusted to them and not misuse it or wrongfully disclose it. And what we've also stated, and this is perhaps a new element, is that institutions shall support their researchers in maintaining promises of confidentiality. This is all in Article 5.1. That is, I believe, a new aspect. Some of the changes to Chapter 5 have been informed by, current events or research incidents over the course of the last decade or so. So certainly the Olivieri case at the University of Toronto is one that caused us to look more closely at our provisions on privacy and confidentiality and what the institution's role is in supporting the researcher and doing its bit to protect confidentiality. Although I haven't mentioned them in the slides, I was trying to be perhaps overly economical with the slides, but I'd like to refer to Articles 5.2 and 5.3 as well, which aren't noted there. Article 5.2 talks about the requirement that researchers describe what measures they will take to meet confidentiality obligations and to explain any reasonably foreseeable disclosure requirements. So there is that kind of tension between the need to keep things confidential, but it sometimes butts up against a legal obligation to disclose. So researchers need to explain that not only in the application materials they submit to the ethics board, but of course during the consent process with prospective participants. So, for example, a researcher doing research in the area of violence and domestic violence, and doing interviews with adolescents, for example, may come across, and it's certainly foreseeable that they may come across some evidence that an adolescent is experiencing violence in the home. And there are, of course, provincial laws requiring disclosure of that kind of information. So a researcher needs to be aware of his or her legal obligations and needs to make people aware of those obligations as well, as that may affect their willingness to participate. Article 5.3, we then move into a section on safeguarding information. And in Article 5.3, we require researchers to provide details to the REB with respect to their proposed measures for safeguarding information. And that means for the full life cycle of the information: collection, use, dissemination, retention, and disposal. So this is something that is not necessarily new, but we have tried to bring more clarity and precision to our guidance. And one thing that is new is 5.4, where institutions or organizations that hold research data have a responsibility to establish appropriate institutional security safeguards. So the obligation is not just on the individual researcher, but also on the institution. So that's, I would say, an expansion of the requirement to safeguard information. The next section in the chapter, Section D, talks about consent and the secondary use of identifiable information for research purposes. These two articles, 5.5 and 5.6, and in particular 5.5, ended up eliciting probably the bulk of comments that we got on this chapter, I think it would be fair to say, because it's a controversial section in the sense that it allows for the possibility of using identifiable information, secondary use of identifiable information, without returning to the original donors of that information for consent. Now, I rush to say this is an exceptional provision. There are 6 fairly rigorous conditions attached to it, and even if a researcher succeeds in satisfying those 6 conditions, it is still within the discretion of the Research Ethics Board to deny approval for this exception. So this is not something that is taken on lightly or done lightly. There are there's a fairly rigorous level of review for this. But we felt that that this provision was in line with provincial and federal privacy law. So I would encourage you, if this area of it is of interest, to look through those 6 conditions carefully. Just briefly, a researcher who's seeking this exception to consent must satisfy the REB that first, the identifiable information is essential to the research. Secondly, that the use of identifiable information without the participant's consent is unlikely to adversely affect the welfare of the individuals to whom the information relates. So this, of course, relates to how sensitive is this information and how sensitively is it guarded by the original donors. Thirdly, the researchers have to take appropriate measures to protect the privacy of individuals and to safeguard the identifiable information. Obvious, clear. Fourthly, the researcher has to comply with any known preferences previously expressed by individuals about any use of their information. So, for example, if in the initial use of that data or that biological information, someone has said, I'm giving this tissue for the purposes of this research project, but I don't want it ever to be used again, then that wish must be recorded and respected. Fifthly, it must be impossible or impracticable to seek consent from individuals to whom the information relates. So this is something more than simply it's inconvenient for the researcher to go back and seek consent from the original donors of the information. And we do try and explain what we mean by impossible or impracticable. And sixthly, the researchers must have obtained any other necessary permission for secondary use of information for research purposes. So sometimes it's not sufficient to get REB approval. You must also, for example, get approval from a school authority to have access to school records, or from Statistics Canada to have access to their records. So you must show that you have that all other necessary permissions as well. And even with all of that, if a researcher satisfies all those conditions, the REB may approve the research, but it's not automatic that it does so. So that's Article 5.5, and then Article 5.6 is related in that if you have received permission from the REB to go ahead and do this secondary use without consent, you may nevertheless find in the course of your research that you actually do want to go back and recontact some of those individuals for whatever reason related to your research. And in that case, you would have to come to the REB and receive approval for how you're going to approach that, because obviously these are people who are, at this point, unaware that this secondary use has been undertaken. So there's guidance in Article 5.6 about how to do that, and of course the need for REB approval to do that. And Article 5.7, which is the last in that chapter, deals with data linkage, and states that researchers who propose to use data linkage must obtain REB approval prior to carrying it out, unless the research relies exclusively on publicly available information. So you see the importance of that term. But the application has to describe the data that will be linked and the likelihood that identifiable information will be created through the data linkage. So obviously, even if you are linking to, say, anonymized sources of data, or even what you believe to be anonymous sources of data, but the linkage may create identifying information, you must seek REB approval for that. And you must demonstrate why the data linkage is essential to the research and describe any appropriate security measures that you're going to put in place to safeguard the information. So that, in a very rapid nutshell, is Chapter 5. And I wanted to just highlight Chapter 7 deals with conflict of interest. It's largely not a new chapter. We do discuss, I think, a broader array of conflicts of interest than was previously the case. In particular, we note that institutions themselves are sometimes subject to conflict of interest. It's not just researchers or just research sponsors or REB members who may be subject to conflict of interest. So an institution may have a reason to be pushing a particular piece of research. And that's one of the reasons why we safeguard in other parts of the document the independence of the REB in its decision-making. So it should not be influenced by the research desires of its institution. It's created by the institution, but it's independent with respect to its decision-making. And that's the reason why, for example, we do not allow institutional administrators or people like the vice president of research of an institution to sit on an REB in order to specifically avoid that type of conflict of interest. I just wanted to mention briefly that we do have a new chapter on multi-jurisdictional research. This was an area covered by a single paragraph in the old TCPS, and we felt that with the growing importance of multi-site research and the need to, where possible, streamline ethics review of multi-site research, rather than going from one institution to the other and getting multiple single-site reviews, we have devoted a brief chapter to stating explicitly that there are all kinds of models that institutions can engage in to streamline and to more effectively review multi-site research. And we provide some examples. They are just examples. They are not a limited or exhaustive list. And we just encourage the use of models that are appropriate to the particular research project. So clinical trials, which I gather is another area of possible interest for this audience. This chapter has been, obviously this chapter existed in the old TCPS. We have reorganized and restructured it, and again, we begin with a set of key concepts, including clinical equipoise, the duty of care, therapeutic misconception, and we also talk more broadly about the different types of clinical trials when we discuss them in the initial article. And that's because previously we really were focused, this chapter was really focused primarily on pharmaceutical trials and talked about the phases of drug trials, but we're well aware that there are many different kinds of clinical trials, including psychotherapy trials, medical device trials, trials of natural health products. They each may bring up their own specific issues. We actually have not, I would say that's an area where we could still fill in the gaps in the future. To the extent that those other types of trials may have specific ethical issues, we haven't necessarily addressed them. We've just described those types of trials. But we hope that the guidance in the rest of the chapter can apply to any type of clinical trial. The section on placebo-controlled trials is not particularly new, although the introduction to it just tries to set the context a little bit better. One area that is new is the requirement that all clinical trials be registered. That means all phases of clinical trials, if it's a drug trial, must be registered, and we specify that they must be registered in a recognized and easily web-accessible public registry. So this is something that puts, I think, the TCPS in line with international ethics documents like the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Medical Association and the requirements of the World Health Organization. But it is a first in this country. I'm just trying to point out a few things that may be a little bit new. when we talk about assessing safety and minimizing risk in a clinical trial, we say that the researchers and REBs should ensure that the foreseeable risk to participants is justified by the potential benefits and appropriately minimized. And in that context, and I should point out that all of our articles are relatively short and to the point, but they're followed by more lengthy application sections where we discuss in greater detail what kinds of considerations the researcher or the REB should have top of mind as they're trying to apply that article. That's where we give examples of what we mean. And in this case, we talk in the application section about the fact that the researcher needs to demonstrate that they've done a systematic review of the literature because we don't believe that it's ethical for clinical trials to be conducted unnecessarily on questions that have already been definitively answered. Now, reasonable people can differ as to when scientific questions have been definitively answered, but this is just a flag for the fact that this is really of a piece with the requirement for clinical trial registration. What it does is it provides greater transparency both to the REB and to potential participants as to how useful, how new, how innovative is this trial, or has it been done 15 times already? If so, do I really need to give my body to science if this question has already been answered? Those kinds of considerations. We then have a section, a relatively substantially revised section called Monitoring Safety and Reporting New Information. We used to have a section talking about data safety and monitoring boards and adverse events. We've stepped back from using the language of adverse events because it's already contained in a number of international guidelines like ICH, GCP. So we've tried to talk more generally about, bring it down to sort of more basic ethical considerations. So we've talked about the responsibility of sharing new information. And we've defined these terms. We've explained what we mean by that, but basically Articles 11.7 to 11.9 talk about the role that researchers need to play in sharing information. And importantly, and I guess this is an innovation in this document, we were hearing a lot of complaints from research ethics boards and to some extent from researchers that they're required to supply a lot of adverse event information, but that REBs did not understand how to interpret that information. So it seemed like it was an additional protection for participants, but it was really just a welter of confusing information for the REB. So how does that really increase the protection of the participants? Probably it doesn't. So what we have said now is that researchers have to provide REB with a plan for monitoring the safety of participants, including a plan for the tabulation, analysis, and reporting of safety data, and the sharing of other new information in a form that permits REBs to interpret and respond appropriately. And obviously have re-emphasized the need for researchers to promptly report any new information that may affect the welfare or consent of participants. So to some extent, these are not new requirements, but they're phrased in a more, if I can say, generic way, so in a more general way. But also in a clearer way, because we have specified that information needs to be supplied in a manner in which it's actually going to be useful. And by the same token, we have said to the REBs, you have to develop procedures, in 11.9, to review those safety reports and to be able to take appropriate steps in response. So the REBs have to be available to the researchers when that new information comes in and be able to respond, whether it's a question of informing participants immediately or even perhaps stopping or suspending the research in an extreme case. We've referred to financial conflicts of interest in Chapter 11, but I should point out that we're well aware that financial conflicts of interest arise not just in respect of clinical trials. So you will now see in the general chapter on conflicts of interest, there is also a section on financial conflicts. It's just repeated here because it often comes up or is thought to arise, particularly with respect to clinical trials, where there's often a commercial element, or there may be. And we talk about the need in 11.11 to review a clinical trial budget, again with a view to ensuring that there are no conflicts of interest. And we have a more expanded section on the analysis and dissemination of clinical trial outcomes. And again, this is all with a view to, just like clinical trial registration, it's in the same spirit. The point of research is to advance knowledge. You can't advance knowledge if it's kept secret. So if things aren't published, if research outcomes are not disseminated, then the research does not serve that purpose. So in Article 11.12, we talk about the need for institutions and REBs to take reasonable measures to ensure that sponsors, researchers, and institutions publish or otherwise disseminate the analysis of data and the interpretation of clinical trial results in a timely manner without undue restriction. And we explain that much further in the application section. And we talk about the fact that any prohibition or undue limitation on publication or dissemination of findings from clinical trials is ethically unacceptable. And we encourage institutions to develop written policies regarding the acceptable and unacceptable clauses in clinical trial research contracts that relate to confidentiality, publication, and access to data. These are often the most controversial areas in these contracts because often sponsors want to maintain control over what information is released or when it is released. So this is our attempt to underline that although some restrictions may be permissible, for example, in respect of intellectual property rights, undue limitation must be discouraged. The last two, just a word about the overall way the whole TCPS2 is organized. The first 7 chapters are largely the general chapters that apply to any form of research. After that, we get into specific chapters on particular types of research. So, for example, qualitative research, clinical trials, and then the last 2 chapters on human biological materials and genetic research. So those final chapters are meant to explore ethical issues that we feel are unique to those areas of research or predominant in those areas of research. It doesn't mean that the rest of the document doesn't apply. It certainly does, but we've tried to hive off some special issues in those chapters. So for human biological materials, I would point out that the type of exception that I described under Chapter 5 for secondary use of identifiable information without consent, there is an absolutely parallel provision in Chapter 12 with respect to the secondary use of identifiable human biological materials. And there are also provisions on, sorry, I haven't advanced my slides here. So that would be 12.3 and 12.4. We have provisions on the storage and banking of human biological materials, a section on that, and a section on research involving materials related to human reproduction, and finally, our section on research involving pluripotent stem cells is really reliant on the CIHR guidelines for human pluripotent stem cell research, which we've incorporated by reference into this document and which we're hoping to incorporate fully in the not-too-distant future. So I don't want to run out of time because I really think your questions are probably the most interesting part of these presentations. So for the last chapter on human genetic research, I just want to refer very briefly to the fact that we require that researchers have a plan for how they are going to manage the information that's revealed through genetic research. And obviously, the article I referred to earlier on incidental findings, although we've put it in a general chapter, it may have particular application for genetic research. That's often where these findings come up. We try to insist on the opportunity for participants to make choices about the information that they receive and to express their preferences about how they want that information to be shared. And we highlight the need for genetic counseling when researchers are planning to share the results of genetic research. So that should be actually part and parcel of the research proposal. You should be planning for that as you're designing your research. And then we have some specific provisions on genetic research involving families and involving communities and groups and the particular ethical implications of those. And I just wanted to, it's a bit of a public service announcement. We are at the moment engaged in education activities. Our work on revising is done for now, although we do have plans to make further revisions and additions to the TCPS. Our immediate priority is to help with the rollout of TCPS2 and facilitate its understanding. So we've been conducting regional workshops across the country. We will be doing our own webinars starting in the fall on specific issues, and we welcome your suggestions for specific issues of interest to you that could be the subject of a webinar. And we're on the verge, we're within a couple of weeks of launching our new and completely new online tutorial. For those of you who may have done the tutorial with the old TCPS, this one is entirely new content and much more interactive, and we hope more helpful. And we do, of course, have an interpretation service. So if there are any provisions of the TCPS that are unclear to you or the subject of controversy within your institution, you are welcome to write to us, and we try to get back within a couple of weeks. We try to get back to you orally within 24 to 48 hours and in writing a couple of weeks. So I think I'm going to just stop there and open it up to questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Susan. So now everybody should see the text box where you can start typing your questions, and Susan will be able to see them and respond to them. I think she'll be starting to come in any moment now.
Okay.
Okay, Susan, can you see the questions?
Yeah, so there's the first question I'm seeing is about the scope of what the TCPS covers. I had said that it doesn't cover community-based organizations and private companies. Why not especially for community-based organizations, as most of their research involves social issues and sometimes economic issues? Might there be problems of privacy and possible harms? Well, the scope of the TCPS is determined by the three agencies, and the three agencies only have a mandate with basically academic, largely speaking with academic institutions. So if your institution has not signed a memorandum of understanding with the agencies, then it is not subject to the TCPS. Any organization is welcome to adopt the TCPS, but only those organizations who have signed on to the MOU are required to. I hope that responds to that. It's not a question of what kind of research a community organization may do. And there was a second question from that requester. Why isn't evaluation covered by REB analysis if evaluation might involve meeting humans? And is it because evaluation reports mostly don't get published? The TCPS, this is a distinction we have made between research and evaluation. It is not because evaluation or quality assurance are not areas of activity that have ethical aspects to them. They certainly do. We have just, this document is concerned with research, and we had to define what research was, and things that fall outside that definition of research just don't fall under the purview of research ethics boards. That is not to say that people doing evaluation activities couldn't benefit from some ethics review. It's just that all activities that have ethical aspects to them are not necessarily covered by a research ethics board. So now an issue comes up, of course, there's a gray area. Sometimes data are collected for the purposes of things like evaluations or quality assurance activities, and later they're proposed for research purposes. That's a bit awkward. That would, at that point, be considered secondary use because it wasn't information originally intended for research. So all those provisions about do you have to go back and get the consent of the information donors or not come into play. And we've tried to make the distinction between what is and is not research, not on the basis of just are the results going to be published. We know that publication was often used as the determining factor to sort out that gray area. And what we have said in the new edition, or what we feel, is that a better guiding line is if this is research, it's something that's entirely voluntary for me. If you're giving me a questionnaire or you're interviewing me because I'm your employee, and you're trying to figure out if you're, or I'm a client for somewhere, and you're doing this for a client satisfaction survey, that's not research. That's something that I'm being asked to do, or perhaps even obliged to do, because of the nature of my employment, or because I'm a student. So that's not the same as research. So we feel that that too is a better distinguishing line than simply whether the results are going to be published or not. I see a number of other. What's the panel's position on compliance to TCPS2 for ongoing studies approved under the first edition of TCPS? Is there a recommended timeline for implementation of TCPS2? As a large academic teaching hospital with 1,300 active studies, is it appropriate to require updating ICFs? Informed consent forms, I'm guessing. Yes. That is, to be to be TCPS2 compliant upon submission of an amendment unrelated to TCPS2 and/or at next annual review. Well, officially, TCPS2 became the active official position of the agencies on the date that it was adopted by the presidents in early December of 2010. So, in theory, as of that date, institutions should have been starting to apply it. Now, we realize that it's not possible to change over from one day to the next. So I think, and they have not, the agencies have not set out a specific date by which they expect all institutions to be using it. In a sense, they expect them to be using it now. So obviously for new applications coming in, but certainly in terms of ongoing review, you should start to be governed by TCPS2 with respect to your ongoing review. So something that was approved, a piece of research that was approved in 2009, when it comes up for renewal according to whatever schedule you had agreed to, at minimum annual renewal, then the new TCPS will apply. This should not be scary or radical, because certainly with respect to initial review and ongoing review, the principles are really essentially the same. The fact that we've provided greater clarity or more examples doesn't mean that the basic obligations have changed. So not a radical change. If you need to revise your forms, or you feel that some institutional changes need to take place, then obviously you have some time to adapt them. As I say, the agencies have not set out any strict timelines at this point. So it's a question of you getting yourselves up to speed and reviewing your own institutional policies to see whether any changes need to be made. TCPS2 does not differentiate between researchers and research platforms providing data to researchers. What aspects of TCPS2 are most relevant to research platforms? Well, I'm thinking that you've probably, it's funny, having waited 12 years to do this change, we're probably going to be out of date, in 6 months, because research platforms are not really discussed per se. I think the most relevant portions are portions of the document are the portions on biobanks and data banks. And if you search, because it is searchable, if you search for biobanking or data banking, you may find some relevant information. But if you have, I'm the first one to admit that this policy may not cover the latest technology and may not answer all your questions. So that's the kind of question which, if you feel that once you have a chance to go through the policy, there are specific issues that are not addressed or that you believe are not addressed, please send them in to us. This is very much a document that is still dealing with research that's collected by an individual researcher or team of researchers. It doesn't speak, obviously the secondary use is going to incorporate people who are using data banks or research platforms, but I don't know if it provides the kind of guidance that you're seeking in that question. So just going to there are a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to go on to the next one. Given that Chapter 5 devotes considerable attention to secondary use, could Susan perhaps comment on pan-Canadian surveillance projects when the data these projects produce are often used for research? Do you know, I think all are often used for research purposes. One gap that we were very aware of as we were doing this is the gap on epidemiological and public health research. We know that there are specific issues that are not covered by our kind of more individual research-based approach, and this was something that we thought we would be able to address in this edition of the TCPS, and it just proved not possible. But it's actually our first priority as we go forward to do more evolution. I say we're doing education now, but that doesn't mean we have left evolution to the side. And I think that kind of question about surveillance research is something that we're going to have to address, and we're trying to pull together a team of people who do that type of research to get their input into how it could be best addressed, because we do think that there are unique aspects to it, and we don't think that the document necessarily addresses those well currently. So another admission. If a study is primarily quality improvement but contains elements of research that will be disseminated generally, then is it reviewable by an REB? Yes, I think the answer is that if there is an element of research, then that is subject to REB review. That's the short answer. I note that Chapter 5 of TCPS 2 clearly states that the guidelines are subject to legislation and that researchers must comply with all applicable legislation. With respect to privacy legislation in particular, are your education activities addressing the relationship between such legislation and the TCPS? Well, this is not a document that is meant to provide legal advice. So we do provide general reminders to researchers that they must follow privacy legislation. We do not believe that there is anything in the TCPS that is contrary to privacy legislation or that would lead you into conflict. We have, however, talked about the fact that, and we do know that some researchers feel there is a conflict at times between their obligation to protect the confidentiality and privacy of the research participants and an obligation to disclose that may be held in legislation. For that, I would point you to, in the first chapter, to an article or a provision called Research Ethics and Law. It's found, if you're looking at a hard copy, on page 12, but it is in Section C of Chapter 1 of the document. And it talks about that tension, and it refers, in fact, specifically to privacy legislation and the Charter. And what we've tried to do is talk about how you achieve a balance between the two. We know that some researchers feel so strongly about protection of confidentiality that they would be willing to buck disclosure requirements that are legal requirements. In a couple of very extreme cases, researchers have even been willing to go to jail, been found in contempt of court and gone to jail rather than, so they would rather obey their ethical conscience rather than obey the law. We hope that in most cases tension between the two can be resolved. And that's what we encourage researchers to do through consultation with their colleagues, sometimes through seeking legal advice. There is no simple answer to that question, but I would refer you to that portion of Chapter 1 and some similar language in Chapter 5. It's probably worth noting that there is a court case that's just been begun, a class action in British Columbia, that is challenging the storing of blood taken from newborns as part of a genetic screening process, and the fact that stored blood has been used on a couple of occasions for research without the knowledge or consent of the parents. So while that storage and use does not actually conform necessarily with how the TCPS how those exceptional provisions that I went over today are phrased. It will be, of course, a very important case to watch because the court may pronounce on limitations to how you use material that was taken for one purpose and used for another. So that's something to watch. The name of the cases, LD and ED, and Natalie Doherty, and the British Columbia Women's Hospital and the British Columbia Children's Hospital. Regarding, I'm probably out of time here, but I'll just perhaps go for one last question. Regarding studies that commence their lives as retrospective chart reviews and subsequently evolve by virtue of amendment to the protocol into requests for human tissue for biomarker research, accompanied by a request for waiver of informed consent under 12.3, is this something that was contemplated by those drafting TCPS 2? I don't think that we we didn't try to contemplate specific instances of specific research design. Once you're, I think the general principles apply fairly well. If you started out doing one thing and you have now amended it such that you are actually doing something else, that falls very much under the provisions where you have to go back to your REB. There's provisions in Chapter 6 on the governance of research. Article 6.16 talks about requests for changes to approved research. The kind of change you're talking about is fairly substantial and might even be considered basically a new research project. So that's something that you would have to go back and check with your REB because it may change the level of risk to participants. It may change what you want to inform them in terms of ongoing consent. So I think that's, although we didn't contemplate necessarily that specific example, I think that's covered. And there are other questions, but I hesitate to keep people over time.